let's go on the Landsat story. Can you help me understand what the situation was like before 2008?
Yeah, sure. At least for Landsat, that date would date back to about 1972, even before, but the first satellite was launched in 1972. And the relationship was such that NASA, the U.S. space agency, would build and launch the satellites and operate them, but then would often turn it over to an operational organization, and in this case, the U.S. Geological Survey, to handle the data that would come back down from the satellites. And that's not atypical of the relationship that, say, NASA would have with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, for the weather satellites. So one entity may build and launch them, another entity may operate them. Now, you can imagine back in 1972, and maybe to this day, NASA has orders of magnitude more resources than, say, the Geological Survey. So at the time, the Geological Survey argued that they didn't have the resources to distribute the data or those Landsat scenes for free. So they would either need additional money from Congress to do it, or they would have to sell the data. And that's the scenario that we got into, was the NASA built and launched the satellites. The USGS would, a few years later, operate the satellites, but they always had responsibility for the data distribution and always sold the data. And I can tell you that even back in 1972, there were people, they were arguing right from the get-go, we need to be giving this data away, but didn't have the resources to give it away. Okay, there were a lot of costs that were associated with bringing the data down, creating Landsat scenes, and then distributing those scenes on, at that time, disks, floppy disks probably. So I want to be very clear that there was a vision, even back in 1972, to distribute the data. Over that entire history, from Landsat 1 up until what you just said, 2008, the data was always sold for $500 a scene. When the U.S. government sold those Landsat scenes, in the middle of the program with Landsats 4 and 5, the government had actually transitioned it to the private sector, and the data increased by an order of magnitude. It went up to $4,000 or $5,000 a scene, and that almost killed the entire program because no one could afford to pay that kind of money for one Landsat scene. So then it transitioned back to the federal government about the time for Landsat 6, although that satellite ended up in the ocean, and then of course Landsat 7, Landsat 8, and I came into the picture about Landsat 7, where I had responsibility for that part of the program in the Geological Survey. So that's kind of the history. And of course, coming into that division, I heard these stories, that we sold data. We looked at the statistics. We were selling about 53 scenes a day. So 53 Landsat scenes times 365 days a year. We were taking in about $4.5 or $5 million for the sale of that data, which is not inconsequential, to any federal agency. Particularly the size of the Geological Survey, $4.5 or $5 million is substantial. But I would argue we were asking the wrong question for a very long time. After you have invested hundreds of millions of dollars, in fact, billions of dollars, from Landsat 1 up to Landsat 7, how could you justify the expense of that program by only selling 53 scenes a day? So we did we did a survey analysis. Who's buying those 53 scenes a day? Number one, other federal agencies. Number two, contractors who were largely working for the Defense Department. Number three, universities. And then some citizens. Okay. So other federal agencies with federal money, we're paying that $4.5 million to another federal agency. So what that means is you're taking money out of this pocket from a federal government perspective, you're putting it in this pocket, and you're incurring transaction costs for at every step of the way, because we had to account for those sales. That other federal agency had to kind of put processes and procurements in order. It wasn't efficient. So we went back to Congress and said, this isn't efficient for the federal government. We should, and at that time the technology had changed so that you no longer had to send a scene, a Landsat scene, out on a floppy disk. You could in fact distribute it over the internet. And so we went back to Congress, first the Department of the Interior, and then the Office of Management and Budget, who works for the White House, and then Congress, and said, you know what, this isn't right. And it took many years to convince them. But what happened is what we predicted would happen, is that the usage, the distribution and usage of Landsat data, if you remove that constraint of selling the data, would just explode. And it did. We went from 53 scenes a day to 5,300 scenes a day. That's 2 orders of magnitude, right? And then later, I had left the organization at the time, but we did an economic analysis. The organization did an economic analysis in about 2011 that just showed it was a public policy change within the United States that returned an economic benefit of $1.7 billion to the U.S. government, $400,000 outside for Europe, here, China, wherever, across the world, South America, for a global total of $2.1 billion. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, for a policy change.
For a policy change, and it far exceeded the $4.5 or $5 million that we were collecting for selling that data.
If you like this, you can actually listen to the full interview right here. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time. Cheers.